Thank you, Dr. Ariely. You have really, in a very fascinating way, kind of opened the discussion and introduced your book about the nature of regime in Israel. And you have very rightly pointed out, I mean, in terms of how definitions, can be imposed, and most of the time they emanate from the vantage point of a individual or a group's understanding of the other. In that sense, I think Israel, provides a very good example in how polarizing the debate becomes when it comes to, many other debates also, but also the political system and political culture in Israel. And it was a fascinating, introduction to your book. You have very, clearly pointed out that calling Israel apartheid regime, then how does one actually understand? Make sense of such a large number of Arab citizens of Israel, participating in the elections, and at the same time, there are residents in Jerusalem, the capital city, who are not able to, participate in the elections and participate in the voting process. I'm sure you have picked the interest of the audience, and I'll now kind of request everyone to please write your questions or comments in the chat box, or please raise your hand in case you would like to ask your question. As the we have some senior members who kind of are in the audience. May I now request Professor Joseph Kishishian to kind of use his, ask his question or comments. Professor Kishishian.
Thank you very much, Muddassir, and thank you very much, Professor Ariely, for a fascinating presentation. As I was listening to you, and I really liked the way you classified the various democratization processes, the one that really caught my attention was orthodemocracy. And that is fascinating to me, because the question that really poses itself is whether or not a society that is religious by nature can become a democratizing society. Of course, we've seen this not just in the case of Israel and the Jewish state, but we've seen it in Europe when for centuries, the papacy and the religious dogma prevented democratization from taking off. The same thing as well in most of the Muslim world, where we have seen religious values dominate the search for democratization and political participation. So my question to you is the following, and this is related to, maybe you've touched it in the book, and you can perhaps elaborate on it in your answer. It really takes off, to paraphrase Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, whether or not we can see in the future the threat of democratization, not from clash of civilizations among nations, but within nations. That is democracy in Israel threatened by internal religious cleavages? I will be interested in hearing your comments on that.
Should I answer?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot. I think it's very important question. First of all, it's important because the classification of Israel as an orthodemocracy by one of the scholars who written about Israel is rather unique, because this classification is based only on the religious aspect. Most of the debates about how to classify Israel is based on the ethno-national cleavage between Israelis and between Jews and Arabs. So in a sense, by focusing only on this aspect, the important question of religion is ignored. And I argue that any name that you give to the regime, camouflage or will not be able to see that the religion is also an important factor. For example, I show you in the slide that the liberal aspect or the liberal rating of Israel is rather low compared to the political contentions. Because in Israel, there is a freedom of religion, but there is no freedom from religion. Because the religious establishment, and this is why, this is the argument behind the classification of Israel of ortho-democracy, because the religious establishment, both for Jews and for Muslims, don't enable the individual choice when it comes for example, like aspects of marriage. Just one example. And also issues of equality, gender equality. It's also a very prominent issue when there are clashes between the religious aspect and the liberal aspect. So this is one part of the answer. Another part of the answer, again, it's the concept of democracy itself. Because in a sense, what you're referring as the clash between religion and democracy refer mainly to the liberal aspect of democracy, in a sense that it reflects the liberal values and the limits of state power vis-a-vis the individual. But democracy, it's not only the liberal democracy. Democracy is also the will of the people. And when the people are religious, or when there is a dominance of religion in the eyes of the people, there is an inherent clash in democracy itself. So I disagree, in a sense, I disagree with, or I think that my offering to view democracy in much more untangled way can take the debate of the clashes between religious and democracy one step further. Not just debating if it's a debate between democracy and all and religious and all, but look on how different perspectives of democracy are related to different aspects of religious forces. For example, in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox gained prominent political power. And their power is a reflection of a democratic process because they participate in the democratic process. But their power is used to undermine a liberal process in the Israeli society. So any classification of just one aspect of this process as democratic and anti-democratic, again, undermine our ability to understand the process, and we go into the political debate, it can even have some more normative implication by arguing to those religious people, you are not, you are under the democratic, but they practice by using your democratic practices to advance your worldviews. So I think that the conceptual elaboration is important about the way you reframe the question. Now, when it comes specific to the clash in Israel there is a clear division between the secular camp and the religious camp when it comes to liberal values. And this cleavage is very evident in the political system, in the political parties, and it's much, most of the political debate is around this cleavage all along for years. But so far, this cleavage did not undermine the level of the democraticness of the regime, because again, amongst the Jews, the commitment to Zionism bridge this gap. There is also some imperative commitment to the states itself. Again, not among the ultra-Orthodox, it's a different story, but there is a commitment to find a delicate joint balance. There is a very important quote in Israel, we are all Jews, in the sense that there is something that unites Jews behind these cleavages, and this is used to undermine the potential damage of this country. Again, there is debate, for example, there was a liberalization process in the 90s that there is a bash against this liberalization process, as well as other countries. Now, it's not unique to Israel. I think we can always also see it in India. Ariely wrote about it in a way, and there was some backlash to that. But these changes are in the playground of the regime itself. It's not a clash to the extent that you can find in Turkey, for example, between the religious and the secular part of society, which transformed the level of democraticness of the regime, as we've seen in the last 25 years, to different directions. I hope it's answered your question.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ariely. I think you have really, kind of tried to answer in a very elaborate manner. You have also kind of made me think about many other examples where you have, some degree of democratization process, where has led to orthodox forces coming to power, and then the reversal of, I'm thinking right now in the back of my mind about Turkey, but there can be many other examples, certainly. Thanks again. May I now request Ambassador Sanjay Singh if he has any questions or comments. Sir?
Thank you, Muddassir. Thank you, Dr. Ariely. From your last answer, I want to think that your analysis is perhaps applicable to a number of other geographies. And in a context, and one aspect of that is that states facing non-traditional threats become overtly dependent on security forces and their imperatives. And this naturally has implications for the democratic polity. Here, the role of leadership is very important and can lead to inclusiveness or otherwise. What is your understanding of the role of leadership in such a context? Thank you.
Now, your question, in a way, it's the billion-dollar question in political science, because a political scientist, and again, and this is the world where I come from. We're all aware that political leadership is probably the most important issue. It's the actor in the system who changed things, who to different version, to inclusiveness, etc., etc. But there is also a consensus that this is the most problematic topic to analyze and to study. We know that it is important, but we have very, very limited to analyze the way leadership behave without just descriptions. And this is why in political science analysis, we most of the time look on context. We look on the way political culture explains democratization. We look on the way religious is related to the level of democracy. We look on the ways economic development can explain level of democraticness in countries, and to look at outliers like China and ask ourselves why it's an outlier, etc., etc. We don't have any valid tool to understand the role of leadership. At least my scholarly work can only point to the context, to the structural factors, and my argument that given these structural factors, different actors can behave in a way that could promote or undermine a level of democraticness. For example, in Israel, in the last 20 years, there is a very strong political backlash against the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is an agency of liberalization, is an agency of equality before the law. And if I go back to the former question about religion, it was viewed by the religious forces as something that undermined their worldview, their positions, by imposing foreign values on the society, okay? Now, this backlash did not materialize to any meaningful changes in the status of the court. There wasn't any institutional changes in the court. There wasn't any court packing. There wasn't any judge dimension, etc., etc. In the last year or two, given the charges against Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is the most prominent political actor in Israel, there is a situation where these structural factors of the religious forces who are trying to stop the liberalization process and to rule out the role of the court, and the personal interests of Netanyahu, which again is unhappy with his personal situation in front of the court. Yesterday, at the Israeli parliament, at the Knesset, there was the first call of a proposal, of a law proposal, that the parliament could bypass, overrule any decision of the court. Okay? Again, and this is the way a leadership can change the course of democratization when there are other forces who waited for 20 years to make such changes, but specifically it was done in a situation where this leadership needed to address specific political problem. At the same token, and I use this example in order to emphasize the importance to look at a different level of democracy. Yesterday, or in the last few days, there is also a very, very increasing legitimization of a coalition government that will be based on the Arab Party, of the Islamic Arab Party, and this legitimization can be found among prominent religious figures in the right wing, in the radical right wing camp. So in a sense, the situation of Netanyahu, in order to advance his coalition, can also use for inclusiveness of Arab citizens that done in the last 20 years. Just a few days ago, there were letters by the most prominent religious figures in the ultra-order, in the religious camps, who argue that Israeli government that can be use the Islamic Party votes can be justified. This is a huge transformation of inclusiveness. So in a sense, in different ways, a specific actor, Netanyahu, move for a retreat from the level of from democratization, and for another aspect, he's also promoting the inclusiveness. Okay, so in a sense, actors are the most important thing, and they can affect the level of democracy in different ways and to different levels. You can take, for example, again, you mentioned earlier the example of Turkey. We can take Turkey under Erdogan, who was under process of increasing democratization in the early 20s, when it comes to the inclusiveness of the Kurds, and also the inclusiveness of the religious camp and in the political process. And we also see this shift in the last few years in the level of democracy in Turkey. So the actors can change the course to different directions, across different spheres. I hope it's clarified the question.
Thank you, Dr. Ariely. Actually, maybe let me take this opportunity to draw you out a little bit on the question of the Islamic movement in Israel. I mean, the southern branch, there are now, as you were also mentioning, that the Zionist religious group is saying that they are fine with this idea of the Islamic movement, participating in the government. This is quite fascinating, and I was actually writing a chapter on this issue and as to how the Islamic movement in Israel has transformed itself from the way it started in 1970s, and then how it has come to a situation where at least part of the movement is now, on the verge of perhaps joining the government. And your point about how this advances the idea of democratization, I mean, this is something very fascinating. But my question is related to how is it that in the previous election, when it comes to the Likud party and Benjamin Netanyahu, there was a lot of noise about, not even allowing Arab citizens to participate in the election, or a lot of discussion about how they are manipulating the elections, and this transformation within a time frame of 6 months or a year. How does this transformation take place? And apart from those people who are endorsing such transformation, what is the reaction of the other Israeli groups, other political groups in Israel, including the secular Arabs who were for a very long time part of the labor, or later made the joint list. So how is the reaction within the Israeli political groups?
Well, I think that the basic reaction so far is universal surprise by everyone, because the process of inclusiveness of this party in the coalition is something that was, again, it was unimaginable a few months ago. Again, I will emphasize the broader context. The last time that there was an Israeli government who was a minority government, who by external support from our political parties, were the second government of Yitzhak Rabin in the 90s, the government which advanced the Oslo agreements and inclusiveness of Arab citizens and liberalization of Israel. And there was a huge backlash, huge backlash against any government or any decisions, major political decisions that will be made without what is described as a Jewish majority. And you can see in polls from the 80s, there are polls where you can find that among the majority of the Jews, 70%, even 80% of the Jews believe that when it comes to key decisions, the civic majority is irrelevant. Only the national majority of Jews MPs in the parliament can justify such shift. And this was in a way the consensus until the last elections. And we can see how this consensus is changing, and there are several explanations. One, again, is the role of the actor, Netanyahu, who is using it sometimes against the Arabs and sometimes for his own good. But there is also a very long process that we should understand, and this is the effect of the long effect of the so-called Arab Spring on the Arab citizens in Israel. Because the Arab Spring, in a way, showed that not only democracy did not materialize in the Arab states, it also that even the states themselves don't provide citizens the most basic needs and requirements. And in a way, among some parts of the Arab society, this process led to increasing alignment with the state. And this is one aspect. And the COVID process, again, we're all aware, we started the day with awareness to the effects of the COVID. And in a way, in Israel, the government's provision and ability to address the COVID, it's okay compared to the region, and even compared to other countries. There is a very generous financial support. There is a very impressive vacation that there's no COVID in Israel in the last few weeks. And this helped to legitimize the state among major parts of the Arab citizens, because some of them prefer to align to the states than to alternative forces. So, but again, I think it's too soon to really analyze that, because the immediate political reaction is just surprise.
Thanks for shedding light. I was actually trying to write a chapter. I mean, I was writing a chapter more on the transformation of the Islamic movement itself, but then this development happened, and I was completely, confused myself as to what is happening. So thank you for shedding some light on that. May I now request, sir, if you have any question or comment?
Thanks, Muddassir. And very delightful to hear you, my friend, Dr. Ariely. You unpacked your all your arguments of democracy and the typologies. I have a small problem with the title. You use the word very frequently, regime, both in the title and your conversation. Normally, you people use the word Israeli regime, generally communicate an anti-Israeli message. You don't have to say anything beyond that. The moment normally they say Zionist regime, and now somebody say the Israeli regime. But instead of saying the Israeli state, what compelled you to use the word regime?
Well, I use the word regime in the book title and my talk. I don't use the word democracy. And I just use it as an example, but I don't use the word democracy to describe the regime. And I don't use the word state, because my education, political scientist, told me that you have to focus your attention at the most central issue. And again, I explained before that a regime is relation between a bureaucratic body and those who are subject to its influence. So it's not the states itself, it's the relations between the state apparatus and a population in a given territory and behind this territory. So in a way, the word regime is more flexible than the word state, which is more debatable. Regime is a feature of a state and not vice versa. And this is why I used the word regime. And of course, I know that when someone is using the Zionist regime, it's a context. That's why I'm calling it the Israeli regime, not the Zionist regime.
Thank you, Dr. Ariely, for the clarification. There are a couple of questions in the chat box, and one is from Dr. Samina Hamid. She has some internet issues, so she's unable to ask her question, but so I'll ask on her behalf. She says one of the possible cleavages between religion and democracy is the question of accountability. To what extent the ultra-Orthodox parties can be held accountable and not evade state regulation, especially in the context of the recent stampede in Israel?
It's a very good question. It's a very timely question, because just last week we have a huge disaster in Israel, and it was a disaster I would say it simply as in a religious, one of the key religious events in Israel that was ended with mass. Many people have been killed in the way the event was eventually handled, and it's put the allegation about the question to what extent ultra-Orthodox parties and the establishment are accountable to the general public or to the specific public. And again, it's go, I think, for the first question by Joseph about the relations between religion and democracy, and religion and states, in a sense, in cases like the Israeli cases, as well as other cases, when the religious groups which have self-perceptions of themselves as minority, even if minority under attack, view the state as a tool to advance their political needs, religious needs, or to protect themselves from the states. But when this point of departure have to handle with a process where this political establishment get more and more responsibility and get more and more resources and get more and more power, it also put in front the question of accountability, the question of the rule of law. For example, if as a religious a leader of a small party, you are not interested in the rule of law because you have other motivation. If now you are the the minister of health, or you are the minister of education, or you hold the ministry of inferior or other issues, and you have to work in the public by the public administration rule and to use the rule of law and other active, and also be accountable, because you cannot handle this establishment as a shtetl or as a religious sect or something like that for the long time. So in a way, we see a process where the ultra-Orthodox parties, again, until a few years ago, you don't have ultra-Orthodox parties on the government decision board. The ultra-Orthodox parties they didn't hold a role of ministers, the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox parties, but in recent years, they have become more and more part of the ministers holding ministerial positions, and also accountable for ministerial responsibility, and this requires them to be more accountable. So I think that we are in the middle of the process where accountability is a development, at least in these sections of the society. But again, since it's a process, we don't know exactly which direction it will take off.
Thank you. There is another question regarding from Dr. Jatin Kumar. He asks, would you be able to throw some more light on the debate on democracy in Israel within the context of the Israeli basic laws? I mean, how the basic laws, looks at democracy. Oh.
Well, as you might know, in Israel we don't have a constitution. We have basic law, and the first basic law that the world was clearly mentioned, the aspect of the democraticness of Israel before this include equality. It doesn't include what one would understand as the democratic rights, basic democratic rights as you can find in other constitutions. And in the last basic law that was introduced, the national Jewish basic law 3 years ago, you also don't have the word democracy. Equality. The Israeli regime, what is more important is to understand how the Supreme Court developed his interpretation of this law and other aspects of the Israeli system, which put a lot of liberal and democratic aspects to his decisions. But again, because the constitutional base for democracy is limited, there's also a very strong debate about the court, because, as I mentioned before, there is a backlash against this liberalization process.
There is another question by Meenakshi Sadar. She asked, what has been the limits of Israel's projection of liberal democracy, and how has been the approach of the left wing and the right wing groups on the understanding of Israel as an apartheid state or as a democracy? How that places in terms of the debate on democracy.
Well, when it comes to the Israeli public itself and the Israeli parties, there is no debates whether Israel is a democracy or is an apartheid regime. The Israeli consensus is that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. This is the consensus. The debate is the balance between these perspectives. The left will prefer the more democratic aspect, and the right will prefer the more Jewish aspect. But along the political spectrum, from the right wing until all the way to the left, against among the Jews, only among the Jews parties, this is a debate within the frame of Jewish and democracy, and the question of occupation or the control of the occupied territories is not perceived as something that undermines democracy. Again, there are, of course, voices, critical voices from NGOs, from the academia, but there is no political camps that argue, hey, Israel is an apartheid state, we should change our ways. Again, sometimes it uses as a rhetoric to justify different policies, but there is a very, very strong consensus of a Jewish and democratic state.
Thank you, Dr. Ariely. You have really, kind of given a very fascinating account of, the Israeli democracy, contemporary Israeli democracy, and what kind of direction it might be heading at. Thank you for taking your time, also to, taking so many questions and answering all of them. And you have really enriched our understanding of the Israeli democracy with your presentation, and we really look forward to read the book. May I now hand over to Professor Quamar for the final word.